Is your B58 equipped X3 leaking oil? Well, it is a BMW. It's not just leaving its mark. You may actually have an oil filter housing that's leaking. Let's go over to the table and I'll show you all the parts you're going to need to do the job. Everything on the table you see in front of me is what we're going to be replacing here in today's DIY for the oil filter housing. We do have to remove a few other components, so you do see some additional seals, as well as an oil filter, coolant, and oil. So we will be draining the oil, draining the entire cooling system in order to replace the oil filter housing. Coolant does run through this, oil does run through this, so if you have a leak like you saw there, it could be oil, it could be coolant, but what happens with these plastic filter housings is they begin to swell, seals begin to expand, and then the housing can actually crack. Whether it's the oil or the coolant that is leaking out of that housing, that is to be determined later on. However, both of those fluids do run through this housing, so the housing could be the cause of either of those leaks. And some things to keep in mind, if you're doing this oil filter housing, you will have access to the heat management module, which we will be taking care of in another DIY. The oil filter housing is located underneath the intake manifold, so it is suggested to do the heat management module at the same time, and vice versa. There's not typically a service interval for the oil filter housing. Ours has about 80,000 miles on it, and when we get in there, we'll get a better idea of if it's leaking or if it's something else that we're discovering is leaking as well. Some things to consider: the oil filter, when it sits inside of the vehicle, is not exactly straight up and down. It is a little bit of an angle. BMW does have a special tool that we will have in the description below that clamps onto the side of the oil filter housing and catches the oil when doing the service. If you've seen our oil change DIY, we just wadded up some paper towels to make sure that the oil does not wick down below. As that oil leaks down below, it could get into the oil cooler or furthermore behind the oil filter housing, damaging the seals that meet the block. One thing to keep in mind as you're servicing your vehicle, make sure that when you're doing the oil filter that you collect all the oil that comes out of the filter housing to keep the filter housing having an extended life. And with that, let's go ahead and get into some tools we're going to need to take care of the job. You've got a 6mm socket, an 8mm socket, a 10mm socket, a 16mm socket. I've also got a 17mm. I have these two options here. These are E10 external torque sockets. The one on my right is a universal joint, which is going to allow for a little bit more maneuverability in the tight space that we'll be working in. Also, we will have an E14 for some of the strut bracing. Got a T30 in a 1/4 inch, as well as a long T30 in a 3/8. If you look in the front here, I do have a couple of different lengths of 1/4 inch extensions, and then also a couple of 3/8 extensions. I do have this fairly long 1/2 inch ratchet. Got a 3/8 torque wrench here. I've also got a 3/8 ratchet as well as a 1/4 inch ratchet. And then I've got a T20 screwdriver, a small panel tool, a 90-degree pick, and then a small little pocket screwdriver. I also have a little impact driver with a magnetic 8mm socket on there, and then a long pry tool, panel tool, which is going to be very helpful for manipulating some of the harnesses off of the oil filter housing. We're definitely going to need a vacuum coolant filler. We have the U-View coolant filling device, which we offer here at fcphero.com. And then we're also going to need these two crank tool adapters. You can use either one. We offer one from Hazit as well as one from Baum Tools. This is going to allow you to actually rotate the engine and prime the engine once we get the oil filter housing reinstalled. That is definitely going to be a necessary component in order to rotate the engine, so don't think you can go about the job without that specific tool. And then, as with any job in the engine bay, it'll be very helpful to have a couple, or if not, a very bright flashlight. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. Now we are in the back of the vehicle. We're going to go ahead and disconnect the battery. A couple things to keep in mind. The vehicle does have electronic locks and electronic windows. Before you disconnect the battery, make sure your doors are unlocked, make sure your windows are down. You want to be able to still get into the car later on. Go ahead and pull up your little cover back here, and it does have a tether and a hook. We can use that to hold it up out of our way. Flathead screwdriver, we're just going to pop these little 90-degree screws, and then that will expose the battery. And we just wanted to disconnect the negative terminal, which has a 10mm on it. We're gonna go ahead and pop our oil cap as well as our coolant cap and just get ready to start draining the oil as well as the main cooling system. Obviously you wanna make sure that your vehicle is not boiling hot, as this coolant cap would not come off in a good fashion, as well as the oil cap. You don't wanna be draining boiling hot oil, but you do want it to be somewhat warm to make sure you get all your deposits out. Now that we've got the cooling system opened up as well as the oil, You can certainly take off the oil filter housing at this time. However, it's going to be a lot easier once we get that intake manifold off. So we're going to get the car up in the air, drain the oil, and drain the coolant all at the same time and get the belly pan off. We're going to go ahead and remove the little cover here for the drain plug, set that off to the side. With a 17mm socket on a 3/8 wrench, we're going to release the drain plug. And while that's draining, I'm going to move forward up here and start removing this front belly pan. With an 8mm, we just want to take out all these small belly pan screws. And while that continues to drain, we'll start working on some of the screws on the outside. I'll leave those last 4 until we can get to that point and put that drain plug back in. These are also going to be all in 8mm, similar to that front panel. And there's still 4 more holding it back in, but as you can see, still got some oil draining. So we'll catch you guys in a second. Once that's done, we'll put that drain plug back in. So we've already got the old drain plug back in. We used the old washer as well. Right before we wrap this DIY up, I'll go ahead and release that and make sure that we get all the additional oil out. There may be some coolant mixed in with that as well. So do not go ahead and put that drain plug back in with the new washer. We are just draining that so that the oil filter housing doesn't have all the oil in it that would be in the oil pan as well. So we want to get out as much as we can beforehand, and we'll flush out the rest later. We do still have the 4 screws holding this on, so I'm going to go ahead and remove those now and see if we can figure out where that oil leak was coming from. You can see the oil cooler here has some oil around it. That may be from sloppy oil changes and or from the leaking cooler, but we'll get more into that once we have that removed. As you can see, that oil is leaking down onto the subframe as well as the belly pan in that general area. Now, while we still have the 8mm handy, we're going to go ahead and remove these 2 side panels. You can certainly leave them in, but coolant will probably collect on there, causing the coolant to drain in a little bit of a random way. So we're going to get these out of there, keep them clean, and give us a little bit more room. It's going to be that same 8mm screw we used to remove the belly pan. So these do have the 3 screws on the inside of the fender liner and then 3 more screws there. We already got that one out on the belly pan, so you should have a fairly large pile of 8mm screws at this point. Now, in order to get to that coolant hose to drain the cooling system, we do have to do a little bit more disassembly. So we're gonna have to get this air box out, and in order to do that, we need to get this little strut out. With an E14 external Torx and a 16mm over here, we're gonna remove those in order to gain access to the air box. We are gonna start off with this T20 Torx bit in the back here. I've just got a Torx 20 screwdriver. Shouldn't be too tight. Also gonna release this connector, and if that doesn't release as easily as it does for me, you could certainly use a pocket screwdriver to just pop that. Just be very careful as it is somewhat fragile. And then you could certainly get away with a flathead screwdriver. However, I'm going to use a 6mm on a 1/4 inch ratchet with a small extension here. Just want to loosen up this clamp enough so that we can push that boot back and pull out this air box. All right, and then just grab the air box and pull straight up. In theory. There we go. So it does have 2 grommets, 3 grommets there. Make sure that your rubber bushings stay in the body. You may have to push them in a little bit if they start to pop out. And that pretty much takes care of the air box. And I can almost get to the coolant hose. I can see it at least. You want to just get underneath the clip with a pocket screwdriver or a pick, something of that nature. Once that clip is out, you can certainly remove it all the way so you don't lose it, because these things do like to escape, and we can re-engage that one later. Once the clip's out of the way, grab the coupler and just kind of wiggle it until it starts to release. There it goes. If you're lucky like me, you'll get to a point where the coolant will drip out, but it will not explode everywhere, and you'll have a nice slow stream down. That is kind of what we want. So work it so that you can kind of modulate the coolant flow. Now, just go ahead and let the coolant drain, making sure that you have a large enough bucket to get this entire cooling system in one shot, and let that drain. We're gonna catch you guys back once this is all done, and we'll pop that hose back on. All right, now that we have the coolant draining, we're gonna move on to the low temperature circuit. We do have to move this strut out of our way, which is attached with a 16 millimeter on the front and an E14 external Torx on the rear. Once we get that out of there, we'll be able to remove the coolant reservoir as well as some of the hoses down below. Make sure you still have your coolant bucket down there because it may begin to drain a little bit here. The plastic hardline on the outside of this reservoir is very fragile depending on the age and mileage. You're going to really want to be careful to make sure that we do not damage this connector. That line does go up and under the radiator support, and it's probably going to be a lot more difficult than it looks to replace. Probably going to have to take off a lot more components than we're going to want to. So we'll pop the clip off of here, soak this in either some silicone solution. I like to use foaming glass cleaner. It doesn't leave any residue and it still lubricates that seal so we can carefully pull that off. Once that's out of the way, there's a clip on the back here. You may need a small pocket screwdriver or something to make sure that we don't damage that clip. You should be able to take the tang and pull it outward. However, it's probably going to fight you a little bit. So a small screwdriver in there to release that clip. With another hand, wiggle the reservoir up and out. And we are going to have a similar clip to the small housing over here, or connection over here. That little metal clip is going to be on the bottom of this reservoir. There is certainly still some coolant in this reservoir, so we could either extract that now or put another drain bucket underneath. So once this is loosened up, I'm going to grab a small extractor and just pull the coolant out of this reservoir so that we don't make a mess in this engine bay. Now that we have most of the coolant system drained, there's definitely still going to be some coolant in the hoses and stuff, and we're definitely going to open up a couple of other connections. So I'm going to leave the coolant hose open down on that lower radiator hose and have a bucket underneath there pretty much the entire job until we're ready to start the coolant filling process. So we do need to take off a lot of trim panels, including the DME cover, the engine cover, and a lot of this cowling up top. It may or may not be necessary on every vehicle to take the cowl off. The engine cover can certainly come off, but there are a couple of pieces of hardware in the back for the intake manifold that you may want to have this off for. So this should just pop right up. You may have to flex it a little bit and get that out of the way. Cowling trim panel should just pull right out, and you will have this cable hopefully carefully slid in there. When we did get this car, this was not even installed. Once that's out, you can take that trim off. These panels on either side should have a little thumb screw that turns 90 degrees. That side has it, this one doesn't. So you should have to undo the thumb screw to the unlock position, and this should come right out. Now moving on to the passenger side, where we do have the screw, 90-degree turn. There we go. Next, we need to remove the wipers in order to get this lower cowl panel off, in order to get that cowl trim off as well. We may need a wiper tool, but I'm going to try to get them off by hand. Pop both of the caps off. If you have difficulty with those, you can certainly use a pick or a panel tool underneath that. Just careful not to scratch the painted wiper arm. With a 16 millimeter, I'm going to use my impact gun and break these wiper arms loose. And it wouldn't be a bad idea before you take the wipers completely off to put a piece of tape to remind you exactly where these wipers are set up. So I'm going to take a second here and just put a little piece of painter's tape underneath the top of the wiper blade, just so I know exactly where those wipers rest upon reinstallation. Now let's see if I can get these wiper arms off without any special tools. So if you're careful, and again, be careful, the wiper arm assembly is all made of aluminum and it is somewhat fragile. So what I was doing was just pushing my palms against the hinge joint here, which was flexing the splines over here, allowing that to rock back and forth and loosen up. Certainly, we'll have in the description a couple of options for wiper arm pullers. There's a genuine BMW one, and then we have a couple of other options as well. So if you find that your wiper arms are stuck on there, you definitely are going to want to consider a special tool for the wiper arm removal. There we go. And now that we have the wiper arms out of the way, we can pull that cowl up and out. It is secured by a clip or a recess in the windshield here, so you may need to wiggle it a little bit and be careful not to pull the weather strip off of the end of the windshield. There is a couple of screws that hold this lower cowl panel down, and you could certainly work around them by not removing these strut panels, or these strut braces if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these, similar to the ones in the front. It's got an E14 and a 16 millimeter back here. Obviously, working so close to the windshield, you want to be very careful. And that's just to get out these small 8mm screws underneath. Again, you could probably get under there with a wrench and get them out, but so you guys can see all the screws, I'll go ahead and remove these strut braces. Now with an 8mm, we're going to remove these small little trim screws here. It's definitely going to be helpful to have a magnetic one, as you don't want to drop these little screws down in the engine bay. And then this should lift up and away. And now that we have that exposed, I'm just gonna kind of unhook this from here, giving us a little more room. And that should give us enough slack. I'll take that side off, and we'll just hook that up and away off of this cowl here and just kind of stick it on the wiper arms. Now we'll go ahead and just pop our engine cover off. So there is a little foam thing back here. I'm gonna get this out as well. Don't forget to put this on. This is a little bit of a heat shielding or isolation from the firewall. What I'm gonna do is put this on top of our engine cover so that we don't forget to put this back on before that engine cover. All right, now that we've got this all exposed, we wanna start loosening up some of the harnesses up here, as well as taking off the little evap purge valve that is also a common failure on this vehicle. If you are removing this and doing this job, it would probably be a great time to have one of these and replace that with the updated version, as BMW has come out with a couple of Super Sessions since it's come out. So we're gonna remove this harness here. There's two little clips. You can just use your thumb. They are very fragile. Shouldn't really need too much force. And then we're gonna start removing the connectors here. You may need a pocket screwdriver to release this connector. Squeeze that and get that. Just don't forget that this does go underneath this line. Now the back of the valve is just kind of slotted onto that little stand there, and you have a connection on either end. So we're gonna just squeeze both sides here. You also may need a pocket screwdriver to assist in the release of these clips, as they can be a little bit tricky. But with that off there, you can start to walk that back. Same thing here. Again, we may need the pocket screwdriver as a little assistance. Don't pull or pry too much, because this is some fairly fragile plastic. And once we got that loosened up, we can get this out of our way. Get this guy off here, screwdriver. I'm gonna leave this valve attached. These little connectors do come off by just squeezing and pressing that out, but it's gonna be a little bit easier if we just kind of spin this out of our way. Popping that line out of there, and then we also have one more squeeze connector over here in the front of the engine bay. And as you can see, our harness does loop around that, so I'm gonna go ahead and get this, what looks to be a either boost pressure sensor or intake temp sensor out of here. Similar to that other connector we were just working, you may need the assistance of a pocket screwdriver. And now we can get into this little hose fitting here. It's going to be a little tough to get your hand down on both ends of that connector. All right, now we're going to start working on the harness to the DME here. Same thing as the harness in the back. You just have these little small fragile clips. Just push them away, and that should loosen that up. And we've already disconnected the battery in the beginning of this video, which the reason for doing so is because we're taking off the DME connectors. You don't have to label these. You don't have to remember exactly where they go. They should all only go back to where they came off. Getting this one out of our way. Do have a couple of additional connectors here. Get this one out. And then this one does have a small tab that I used my fingernail. You may want to use a little pocket screwdriver. That takes care of that. And then we're going to move on to this one here, but we have to get the second one out before we get the third one out. And in order to unlock these, basically there's a little button to depress. Push that button down, and with your other hand push the little lid or handle here past that, and then when you do that, the action will lift it off of the connector. That one's going to stay over here. That one's going to go that way. This one's going to go this way as well. All right, that takes care of that. The couple of harnesses that we're starting over here is going to lead into this little harness holder, and there's a tab located at the bottom of the connection here. You can just put your finger on it and push up kind of at the same time, and then that'll release, and that tab is just located down here. That should get that off, and we can kind of set that off to the side, and we'll come back to that later. We're going to finish getting the rest of these DME connectors out of here and get this out of our way, because a lot of the next work that we're going to be doing is going to be down under the manifold before finally releasing that manifold. So let's keep going with these connectors. All right, once we get those out of our way, the DME just has a couple of clips that are holding it into place, and you should be able to wiggle it out. So similar to the bracket over here, just use a finger and another hand to kind of work it out, and away she goes. Put this in a nice safe place, no water, no static. Don't put it on a carpet. It can probably shock it and fry a driver inside, but just put it in a safe place. Don't wrap it in a microfiber. Put it on a piece of wood, bench top, something that's not gonna cause any static. All right, let's continue to get this bracket out of here. We need to get this connector out of the back. It does have a little lock in it. Get my finger under it, it'll come out, but I can't. You may need a pocket screwdriver to get that released. And then that should release that connector. So we can get that on the other side. Don't worry, we'll clean this up in a second. Do have one more harness connection back here. Just like every other on top of that manifold, just has the little fragile clips, so be careful. And got a couple harness connections back here we can wiggle off with a screwdriver. All right. So this one does have a couple of clips that go different directions, so you will have to unlock the clips and kind of work the connector out in order to get that released from that bracket. But it does look like everything's released, and we just have a couple of screws on the outside here that look like a 10 millimeter. And we'll get those out of the way and get this bracket out, and then we can continue to work on the manifold. All right, with the 10 millimeter, we're just gonna take out these little sheet metal screws back here, and then one more up front. And then that should loosen that up. I do have a harness connection back here still. And just like everything else, there's a small flat fragile tab where it kind of intertwines together, and we can get that bracket out and away. Now that we've got that out of the way, we can start removing the charge air pipe. We don't have to take the entire charge air pipe out. We just want to remove the couple of screws that go into the throttle body, and we have a new gasket for that. That is not a absolutely necessary replacement gasket. It's kind of an inspect and decide if it has any tears, and just go ahead and thoroughly look at it. But it's included in our little DIY here today, so we'll show you guys how to replace that. So we do have two T30s that hold this into the manifold. I'm just gonna crack those free. They shouldn't be terribly tight. And it should just wiggle out of the throttle body, just like that. So again, we don't have to take that all the way out. We just want to remove that because we're going to be getting this whole manifold out of here. So now we're going to move over to this junction of wiring and try to get that freed up and just kind of move that out of our way. We're going to want to take off the manifold pressure sensor here as well, and any of the harnesses that kind of get in your way for getting some of that hardware. You don't want to pinch any of that when you're putting that back in there, so make sure that you give yourself plenty of slack that we can remove all these connectors. And there's a connector on the throttle body as well. You can loosen the harness up here. So just like every other connector, there's a lock, and then if you need to, you can certainly go under here with a screwdriver and gently pry up on this little tab to help release that connector. All right, now we got to continue on some hoses and little brackets on the outside of the manifold before we're fully moving the manifold out of the way. So we've got a couple of external Torx 10s that we're going to remove here. I'm just going to release these brackets here. So they are going to be firmly mounted down to the engine block, but as you can see, they are loosened up. So once we get the manifold released, those should be able to come out nice and easily. Now we got to take out two more coolant hoses, and there's really no way to put a drip tray underneath here. So we're going to go ahead and move our coolant bucket down kind of offset to the driver's side of the engine bay. And the first hose we're going to take out is this little 90-degree elbow. The clip is going to be off to the left side when you're standing on the side of the engine bay. Once you get that released, As you saw, that coolant hose was on there rather tight. And I'm gonna make sure that's draining down into the bucket. You can't see anything, I can't even see it, but the opening for the clip is underneath the left flange. And I think it's in our coolant bucket now. I hope it is. Sounded like it hit the floor. All right, that one's off. Now we are finally ready to take off the intake manifold. There's about 7 bolts holding this intake manifold on. So we're gonna start on the front side of the engine and then go to the back and just kind of go back and forth until we get all those loose. And in the instructions, they do recommend that you keep a hand on the side of the manifold, kind of pushing it up to make sure that those bolts do come out with ease. And it is a 10 millimeter bolt in all of the manifold positions here. All right, so one thing that I forgot was the 2 coolant hoses that are stuck underneath the throttle body there. That was the only thing really hanging us up, so pop those out of that provision there and the manifold should come right out. Also keep in mind that these coolant opening flanges here will be dripping coolant during your removal, so try to tip it in a fashion that it's not going to make a mess all over the engine bay. Now before we move on to anything else, I'm going to wad up some paper towel and stuff it into the intake runners because we don't want anything to fall in there, whether it's a 10 millimeter, a clip, a screw, anything else. You just want to make sure that we have that all blocked off. All right, now that we have the intake manifold runners blocked off, nothing's going to fall in there, we can go ahead and release the oil filter if you haven't done this already. Obviously you can do this in the beginning. It's going to allow the oil to drain down. However, it's obviously much more accessible at this point. So we'll go ahead and crack that free, let that drain down while we continue to work on the wiring harnesses and hoses around the oil filter housing. All right, with the 32 millimeter socket, we're gonna just crack this oil filter housing and we'll let that drain back down into the housing itself. Just wanna get it to the point where that seal starts to raise up over the actual body of the housing and no oil is dripping out, but hopefully it's all draining down below. Next up, we do have to release this coolant hose from the heat management module in order to get to some of the harnesses in the back here. And it does have another one of those pesky little horseshoe clips. Try to not lose this one. There we go. All right, that should be pretty dry since we drained the radiator. You can almost see all the fasteners for the oil filter housing, but we do have a lot of wire harnesses on the outside of this. So take a second, maybe even take a picture, take note of where they all connect, how they're routed. If they are incorrectly routed, you could be creating a problem. The harnesses could rub, could stretch, so you want to get this all back in the exact same place that it was. We do have this coolant hose in the front here. You can either release the actual connector or just kind of pull it off like the wire harnesses we did on top of the manifold. Should just slide right off. Kind of just have to pry up underneath these and open them up a little bit and make sure that those metal retaining clips stay inside of there. Sometimes they do stay on the housing. So we've got another line underneath. All right, this next part, we're gonna be releasing all of the fasteners for the oil filter housing, and honestly, we're hoping you guys can see this at home, but we have the other oil filter housing here so we can show you what we're gonna be working on. There are a couple of bolts on the outside that we're gonna be removing. We're gonna leave the oil cooler on that unit. Actually, when we go to take it out, we're gonna replace that over on the bench. So all the fasteners you see in brass here on the front, those are gonna stay. Those are T30s. What we're gonna be using is an external Torx 10 and releasing all 6 pieces of hardware on the outside of the housing. It's gonna be a little bit difficult to show you these. We got a GoPro down there, so hopefully you guys can see what we're working with, but you'll know exactly what we're talking about when you actually get in there. So we're gonna have to work around these harnesses and hoses a little bit, kind of moving them out of our way. If you're having difficulty getting the housing out, you're definitely getting hung up on a couple of these bolts. These ones down in the back are a little bit trickier than the ones up here, obviously. So if once you get it released, it is still fighting you, you may need to go back and just release those bolts just a couple more turns. So we're gonna take a second and clean up the oil and coolant down there before getting the new housing prepped and ready to go. And I'm gonna let this one drain off before we release the oil cooler. Now you may notice this oil cooler is quite a bit more cleaned up than it was when we pulled it out. Before you go and swap the old oil cooler to the new oil filter housing, take a second, clean this all up, brake clean it, whatever you got to do to try to get it to looking like it is here. Any dirt or any contaminants transferred to the new oil filter housing is not going to be ideal. So take a second, clean it up before you go releasing these bolts, and make sure most of the debris is free from the oil cooler. There is a little bit of a sequence in how to remove this, and I can only assume that is so that the flange on the oil cooler does not warp, and they want you to remove the bolts in 360-degree intervals. So we're going to start on the center bolt on the right-hand side, crack it free, and do a full rotation. And then we are going to move up to this top right, do a full rotation, and kind of work your way all the way around in a circle. All right, now we can continue to release these bolts. And they are a T30. I've got a 1/4 inch extension here. They're not terribly tight. They're about 10 Newton meters again, if I recall. And while I'm taking these out, I'd like to take note that there are 4 gaskets on the oil cooler side of the oil filter housing. There is a provision in the center here that does look like it is missing a gasket. Do not be alarmed. That is how it should be. That does not go in anywhere. That's just a vacant little cavity there that, again, kind of looks like there should be a gasket there, but there's not. So make sure you have the 4 gaskets pressed in there. They're not poking out or anything before we go ahead and transfer this over. There we go. And that takes care of that. As you can see, those gaskets were starting to squeeze out, compress, and just become deformed compared to how risen they are on the new oil filter housing. You can see they stick out about 2 to 3 millimeters, and here they are rather compressed. And as I've stated throughout this video, if the oil filter housing is leaking or the heat management module is leaking, if anything's leaking under that manifold, everything's kind of moving around, spraying around, getting a lot of these components, swelled and wearing them out a lot quicker. So keep that in mind. And also the way that this is positioned, as this leaks all over my bench, when you take the oil filter out here, it is inherently designed to drip down the front of this. So as you saw from the beginning of the video, the oil cooler was coated in a thin layer of oil, basically from where the oil filter drips onto it, and then it may even wick its way in between the cooler and the housing, prematurely destroying these seals from the outside in. So keep that in mind. If you do have an oil leak, it may not just be the housing. It's more than likely the oil leaking from the oil filter during your oil changes and destroying the cooler seals as well as the filter housing seals. So let's go ahead and clean this up and get this ready to be transferred back over to the new housing. So in cleaning the sealing surface of the oil cooler, you want to be sure not to disrupt the sealing surface at all. You want to make sure that we're not using any high-powered sanding wheels or anything that's going to gouge or put any indents in the surface. So I literally just have a rag or a paper towel here with some brake cleaner, and I'm just removing a lot of the residue. You can certainly get away with some isopropyl alcohol. Brake cleaner will suffice. You just want to make sure that you just clean off the surface. If we recall, there are 2 locating pins in there. You want to make sure you get those secured, otherwise the bolt holes will not line up. Same way we remove them, starting in the center spot on the right-hand side. Go ahead and start putting the bolts back in. All right, those are just run in by hand. We're going to do 10 Newton meters with a T30, and again, we're going to start on the right-hand side in the middle, working our way all the way around the outside. I got to 10 Newton meters. And before we go back over to the car, you may notice that there's no hardware in here. We will have to transfer the hardware from the old oil filter housing, and it may not come out as easily as you think, so we may actually have to use a hammer to kind of force it out. There is an O-ring that holds all of these bolts in place around this collar, so it may be having a little bit of resistance to pull it out. And if you see there, the collar did come out with the bolt, so I may need to go grab like 2 wrenches and pop them apart. So if you tried to separate your bolts and the O-rings fell apart like ours did here, they're very brittle. They are very old. They've got a lot of heat transfer from the engine block through the oil filter housing. They are not necessarily a sealing ring, so don't be alarmed if you didn't order the bolts. We don't have them in the kit, but we will certainly have them linked in the description below, and we do stock these at fcpro.com. We actually have 6 here to replace them with. Honestly, the fact that the O-rings fell apart isn't the biggest deal. You can certainly reassemble the job. You don't have to stop what you're doing and order the new hardware. However, it would be nice to have the new O-rings. It's going to make our job a lot easier. I'm going to grab a little bit of Vaseline to help guide these into the new housing, and we'll get these bolts prepped and ready to go. All right, and that's really all the O-rings are there. They're just designed to hold them in place while we drop this into the engine bay. With that, let's go back over to the bay and get this ready to go back inside. All right, now that we have the oil filter housing assembled and we're almost ready to go back in, we do want to prime the engine. And we did drain all the oil before the service, and I did put the drain plug back in. What I did there was leaving a little bit of oil in the oil pan while we're doing the service. If any coolant does mix in there and get in there, hopefully some of that oil that we're going to drain out right now will release any of that, a small amount of coolant that may have transferred over. So at this point, we should be going ahead and priming the engine, but there is no oil in the engine to prime. So what I'm going to do is get the car back up in the air. We're going to take that drain plug out and release any additional oil and hopefully some coolant that may have transferred in there. Put the new drain plug washer back on, torque the drain plug to spec, and then we'll come back up here, put a couple quarts of oil in the system so that we can start that priming procedure. And you will need a special tool for that, so stay tuned for that section in a bit. And we still got a little bit of oil coming out. The car's been sitting for a little bit, but we did have the oil drained. It looks like there's a little bit of coolant coming out with it. But again, keeping a little bit of oil in the oil pan when you're doing this procedure is definitely going to be helpful for making sure that we flush out a lot of that extra coolant and try to give ourselves the best chance of ensuring that there is no coolant when we go to start this engine back up. So we'll let this drain down for a second. We'll get the new drain plug washer prepared on the drain plug, and we'll get that ready to be tightened back up. Now that we've got a steady drip coming out and there's no more oil flowing out of here, we're ready to go ahead and put this drain plug back in. We're going to put the 17mm drain plug back in with the new washer that comes in the oil filter kit, but is also in the oil filter housing kit as well. So we're going to tighten this up to 25 Newton meters. And then clean that off with some brake clean. We've got a 5-liter jug right here. You could certainly go ahead and dump this whole thing in here. However, we just need enough oil in the system that it basically clears the oil pickup so that the pump can start to prime the system. So just a couple of quarts should do. Now for my next trick, we are going to need to prime the oil pump, which means we're basically going to bring oil just to the edge of that oil filter housing flange. And we probably have to get it to the point where it starts to drip out. We'll go back and clean that area up. But basically what this is doing is ensuring that upon startup, we are not starting with a dry filter. Once I get the filter primed, we'll go ahead and put that housing back on. And then once I get the housing on, I'm gonna crack the oil filter housing and fill that up with oil as well, just to ensure that we have as much oil in the system upon startup as we can possibly get. So we do have the special hub tool, as there is no central bolt. You'll notice that the spacing between here doesn't allow for a center bolt here, and there's no pins on the outside of the pulley like some other vehicles. This will allow this tool to sit around the outside of the 4 bolts that hold the hub in, and then we'll have to rotate the assembly. You are going to want to rotate the assembly if you're looking at the crank damper standing in the front of the car clockwise. If you go counterclockwise, the timing could jump, you could skip a tooth, in a worst case scenario, you could even crash some valves. So be sure that you're rotating the engine clockwise. Holding one hand with the ratchet and one hand kind of guiding it in. I'll get this started to go. And what we're looking for is a tiny bit of oil to start poking out of the flange area of the oil filter housing. And it looks like we're starting to get a little bit of oil in that lower flange area. Just want it to barely creep out of that hole. That should be perfect. Now that we got this primed up, I'm just gonna go ahead and clean off that flange, make sure none of that oil spilled out. And just get that area nice and clean. Now we're ready to drop this thing in. Pull your harnesses back out of the way. Make sure none of them are tucked underneath. And finagle this thing back into place. All right, cool. So start hand tightening these up. Now just go around and snug all of those E10 inverted Torx for the oil filter housing up into the block, and you may have to wiggle the housing a little bit just to get them to line up. But once we get all those secured, we'll go back and torque them all down. But you want to just get them all snugged up to keep that flange just resting against the block hand tight. I've got all 6 pieces of hardware securely snugged up, and now that should alleviate from us having to swing the torque wrench, which is not going to really fit into too many places. The torque wrench I'm going to use is pretty much palm size, so keep that in mind. If you have a much larger torque wrench, this next step may be a little bit more difficult. So the torquing sequence for the oil filter housing is a little bit back and forth, if you will. I have the old housing here so I can show you exactly where we're going to be tightening these up. So the top 2 bolts, the second one down is going to be the first bolt. Then we're going to come down to this one that you really can't see down by the transmission, the second one from the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. So keep that in mind. We're going to start with a 4 Newton meter torque spec. Once we go all the way around that, we'll go back and do 10 Newton meters on all 6 pieces of hardware. So again, it's going to be a little bit difficult to show you, but hopefully you guys can pause that, write that down, take a picture. But that is how the plastic housing should be torqued. If you do it in any other fashion, there's definitely a risk of warping or cracking the housing. So keep that in mind. All right, now we're going to go back and torque everything to 10 Newton meters. The next step we want to do is make sure all of these harnesses that are sitting on top of here are resecured. And then once that's taken care of, before we go ahead and put that intake manifold back on, I'm going to pop this oil filter off, fill it with oil, and then we'll get ready to go ahead and put the intake manifold back on. Because yes, it is a lot easier to get to this oil filter now than with the car fully assembled. I know, it's crazy. All right, now we're going to go ahead and refit the harness. And if you have a hard time figuring out exactly where it goes, you can look at the old oil filter housing as reference. There should be little scratch marks where these harnesses were fitted. However, it should be pretty much just like that. It'll lay back into place. You have another one in the front here. Alternator cable to the bottom of the harness, or sorry, to the bottom of the housing. And then this coolant line to the front of the housing. You have, this is going up to the throttle body, so we'll keep that out of the way. Now just make sure everything is clipped into place. Get a good look at your intake manifold connectors. The O-rings look good. Before we go ahead and install that coolant hose onto the heat management module, just take a good look at the O-ring. Make sure it's not flat, it's not broken, cracked, deformed at all. Just going to put a little bit of silicone or Vaseline or even just some new coolant on that to make that roll onto the heat management module a little bit easier. I've already reinstalled the clip as well, making sure that's fully engaged. Give it a tug and that's ready to go. Although we've already primed the engine and had the oil come up to the edge of the oil filter housing, it would definitely be wise to put a little bit of oil into the oil filter as the entire housing is completely dry. So I'm going to open up the oil filter housing and remove that oil filter and put a little bit of oil in there as well. It's much easier to crack this open once it's bolted to the block. You don't have to put the plastic housing in the vise and separate that before. So bolt your housing up if you'd like to go through with the same procedure, and then get some oil in there before putting your new filter back in place. I'm just going to take a second here to swap on a MAN oil filter as well. And as it's written on the top of the housing, the torque spec on the oil filter cap is 25 Newton meters plus or minus 5. So the O-ring is really what seals it. There's no need to over tighten that. So as you saw, very minimal torque on that one. And now we should be ready to go ahead and put our intake manifold back on. I'm just going to take a second, clean all this up I've already wiped down most of the debris and dirt around there with the paper towel still in there. So when you pull the paper towels out, it should take any of the debris that may have fallen into the intake runners. We'll get that prepped and ready to go, and transfer new gaskets over to the intake manifold as well before we drop that into place. All right, before we throw our intake manifold back on, we just want to swap out these 6 green gaskets here. And it's quite easy if you just take a pick, poke the gasket, and pull that out. I'm going to put one in here just to show you the difference of an old gasket versus a new one. As you can see, the new gasket sticks up quite a bit more than the old one, so it is recommended to replace these. They may not seem ripped or anything like that, but they do start to get pretty flush to the plastic surface, so you may want to replace those to alleviate from any future intake leaks. Just do the same thing for the last 5 runners. Now, if you took any of the clips out for the hoses that go into the intake manifold, go ahead and engage those now. I have one still in there, and if you guys remember from the beginning, we lost one down on the subframe. We did have to retrieve that. Click those back into place. Make sure those O-rings are good. Coolant, anything on those O-rings to make it a little bit easier to click those into place for you. Should be able to line up the intake manifold pretty loosely first. Make sure we get all those bolts that line up. We'll start hand tightening those while still being able to kind of manipulate the manifold here. And before you get too far ahead, make sure this bracket's gonna line up fairly close. We're a little bit off, but I think we can kind of flex the bracket enough to get it lined up. All right, with a 10 millimeter on an extension, I'm just gonna hand tighten and start all those intake manifold bolts into the head. So you may need to keep a hand underneath the intake manifold to kind of wiggle everything until you find the bolt holes. All right, we've got those pretty much hand tightened. Let's drop the bolts into these brackets to make sure those do still line up as well before we go tighten everything up over there. You recall, you should have 2 external Torx 10s. And again, we may have to move that bracket just slightly to get everything to line up. All right, now we'll go back and tighten the manifold. We know that those brackets will line up, so we're not worried about that. All right, now we're ready to torque the intake manifold. We're gonna do 10 Newton meters in a kind of a crisscross pattern, starting in the center and then going all the way to the outside, finalizing that torque. The external Torx bolts on the outside of the intake manifold are 8 Newton meters, and the 10 millimeters that fasten the intake manifold to the cylinder head are 10 Newton meters. All right, now we can start buttoning up some of our hoses and connectors. And if you recall, I totally forgot on our way out to remove these coolant hoses from the bottom of the intake manifold. So let's get those started first. Underneath the intake, I'll show you here in a second. Right underneath the throttle body, there are 2 provisions that are marked on the coolant hoses with white lines that need to kind of line up in those little clips, and those should fit nicely in there. And then we can also go ahead and re-secure the intake manifold coolant hoses. They're really not going to go into the wrong place. They're going to pretty much fall back into exactly where they are designed to go. So you shouldn't have any difficulty mixing those up, and they're also fitted a certain way, so they will not be able to be interchanged. Now the one closest to the throttle body, you're going to want to fit that first. And it's also why we engaged the clip already, because that clip is going to be very hard to get into place once the intake manifold is back on. Push it into place. You should audibly and feel the hose click into place. There we go. After a little wiggling and some forceful pushing, coolant hose is re-engaged. Now let's do the rear one. Give it a good tug. If you can, get your finger around it. Make sure that clip isn't popping out or pushed out. Feels like it's firmly engaged. It's locked onto both sides. All right. Now before we continue on, let's get our throttle body finished up here. We did have a connection right here where that's going to link into the intake manifold, right where that sticker is. And then that should allow that connector to kind of fall back into place. All All right, make sure everything is still fitted, everything's snugged up into place. And we're just gonna keep reattaching everything that we took off. We had this map sensor removed here. All right, we're gonna fold this harness back down and so we can get the breather line that was on the side of the intake manifold lined up. So we're just gonna have to flex this back underneath and take a second to make sure that O-ring is not ripped, torn, or anything like that, creating any vacuum leaks. There should be a little bit of oil coming out of there, so it should oil that nicely. But if you do need, you can certainly put a little grease or something like that on there. All right. This harness is going to kind of sit up here. This is going to come around this way. And then we do have a new gasket for the charge pipe as well, so we'll go ahead and replace that while we're in this area. All you're going to need is a little pick, get underneath the seal. You'll notice it is a square seal. It's not like a round O-ring, so you will have to reinstall it the same way it is installed currently. So take note of that. This does have two sides to the seal. The inside is going to have more of a, I guess, kind of a flat surface, and the outside is going to have more of an indentation. So when you're installing it, make sure that this doesn't roll or flip or sit sideways on you. You really want to make sure that it's fully seated, not creating any air leaks. Silicone or Vaseline, any kind of grease right there, allowing that throttle body to seal and seat nicely. And then the two throttle body screws that connect the charge pipe to the throttle body are going to be T30s, and they're 8 Newton meters. So this harness kind of already re-engaged itself a little bit, but there are some tabs on the intake manifold where this will click into place like that. Lay that out. We're going to kind of fit this back in here, and then we're going to lay our purge valve on. If you have a new purge valve, definitely a great time to install it as well. They are kind of a common failure, so definitely consider replacing that while you have it all apart. But just take a second, make sure we have all of our connectors back in place. Kind of lay them all out loosely. We may need to lift this back up to get that purge valve down underneath. So I'm going to grab that purge valve and lay that out as well. And if you remember from the beginning, I did just kind of have this swung out of the way, but it does simply just detach by squeezing these two clamps. And if you have difficulty with that, sometimes you may need to engage it a little bit further before squeezing those clamps and then releasing it. So if you did want to get that completely out of the way as we do here, it's definitely going to make your life a little bit easier working in this area. So I'm just going to drop this underneath this harness, engaging that hose in the front first. This one here, and then slide that over that bracket. And that should sit there. This will lay into that clip back there. So I'm gonna go ahead and engage that back into place. Give that a couple of tugs, make sure it's seated. Otherwise you probably will have a check engine light. At this point, you could certainly fill the cooling system. It'd be a really, really nice time to fill the cooling system because we can see all of the coolant connections that we've had off. The oil filter housing and everything that we had off is really, really not accessible once you put the DME back into place and the cowl and everything. So if you are gonna fill the cooling system at this point, make sure you reconnect the radiator hose on that lower section before doing the vacuum fill. However, we're gonna go ahead and reassemble the rest of the car. Now that we have our intake manifold mostly secured, we've got our coolant hoses all secured back up. And if you haven't already filled the oil filter housing, now is a good time because it's only gonna be more difficult once we continue to put more parts back on. So this should drop into place. Keep in mind, it does have a couple of tabs that we need to line up. And then we have two 10mm screws that we're gonna use to refasten that back into place. So there is a provision down in the frame rail where this does need to line up and it will not drop into place unless that gets guided in. So make sure that finds its home and then get this harness kind of out in front and it should all fall back into place. There is a little dowel on the strut tower where that's going to kind of center itself, and if that doesn't line up then you're probably not secured down below. So we've got the two 10mm. We're going to get these snugged up and tighten these up to 8 Newton meters. It's a very small screw and they do go into the strut tower here Goes into a little bracket back there, but more importantly, it just only goes into the strut tower here, so don't over tighten that as it may snap and you'll be drilling into the body. There we go. We're gonna grab our engine computer, DME, ECU, whatever you wanna call it, and we're gonna slide that back into place as well. And then it should kind of click into place, making sure those locking tabs hold it down. So we do have a couple of harnesses here. Get these all out into the open. Tuck them back a little bit here. So back here we do have this little guide, if you will, and it will slide into the bracket kind of a little bit above it and then dropping into place. So you will have to line that up and kind of keep a hand on it, make sure that lines up good. And that's going to take care of that. This front section here, it is going to use this little stand here and attach into the front of the ECU DME bracket, clicking into place. And then we still have these as well. This one is going to attach onto the intake manifold right here. And then it will slide on top of that bracket we also just installed right there. This one will go in first, and then the others will kind of follow up behind. We're going to get this tucked over here. So this connector cannot go into any other location, so don't be alarmed. It does have a single notch right here, which will line up with the connector here, and it is offset from the other one, and then the third final one will actually have 2 notches in the connector. So you don't have to do any marking. All these connectors will line up, and the harnesses will kind of fall back into the same place as well. Same thing with these large connectors. If you do screw them up, you're not going to be able to put them into the wrong place. This does have a little connection back here, which is going to go onto the back of the bracket. And then the receiving connector for that is down here. This has those little tabs that we talked about in the beginning, which from the engine side will slide towards the outside of the body and click into place. And then we can engage this connector as well. Make sure both sides of that clip into place. And then last but not least, we have this final connector here, which will go on top of everything, and then this little harness connection will click right onto there when we're done. So as I said, everything kind of sits in a certain way. You may have seen the second connector is going to have to get kind of looped back. So as I said in the beginning, it's definitely best to have a picture to make sure all this kind of gets laid back into the same spot. However, if you'll notice during this, we were only able to really lay the harness into one way. Otherwise, it's going to kind of stretch and pull, and it really won't allow you to engage that connector the same way it was before. All right, now we're ready to reseal up our cooling system. We did drain the coolant from this radiator hose, and it's definitely easier to remove these clips all the way. So if you did, go ahead and re-engage it back into the top of the hose, if you can get to it. And then with a little bit of coolant on the O-ring, and obviously make sure that O-ring is still good. A little coolant on the radiator, slide it on there. Pop that back into place. All right, and once it does go into place, that clip should go back right back down, and that's that. All right, now we're ready to slide our air box back into place. If you haven't already, make sure the orange grommets are pushed into the body of the car. If they're on the air box, transfer them back into the car. And furthermore, a little bit of grease on these pegs will definitely help align that and guide that back into place. It's definitely going to be easier if you guide the air inlet first and then kind of engage the grommets into the body. So it's going to be a little bit of a dance, but guide this down. Make sure you get that into the snout in the front there. Kind of hear that click into place as the grommets sink all in together. So, and the air boot should kind of fall into place as well. Make sure the underside of it doesn't roll on you. This little intake muffler here is going to be reattached to the airbox with a T20. Just going to use a hand screwdriver and just snug it up. It's about 3 Newton meters, so not very tight. And then we're going to use a 6mm. You could certainly get away with a flathead screwdriver to tighten up this clamp. And finally, we're just going to reattach the mass airflow sensor connector. And now continuing on resealing our cooling system, let's go ahead and put the small reservoir back in place. We have our small reservoir here, and again, just like all of our coolant hose connections, if you haven't already, engage that clip. Kind of keep a hand on the hose while you line this up. It's going to be a little bit easier to do it like this. And then we're going to slide this into the larger coolant reservoir. It's going to slide downward and then click into place. And then we're going to take the hard plastic coolant line. Again, careful not to break this one. We've already got our clip engaged, and press that on, give it a little tug, and that's that. And while we're over here, this power wire is going to be fed into the cowl here, but it also does get dropped into this module back here. So it is going to go behind the evap line here, because this connection is going to hold onto this bracket here. So under the evap line, down into this module, click it into place, engage the lock, and then the harness will clip on right there. So we're going to keep that up and put that on later. And then if you haven't already, we do have this one connector for our evap line here as well. This was kind of sitting underneath this, just like that. And that's pretty much everything electrical connector wise, other than obviously we have to still connect the battery. And with that, let's move on to the wiper cowl and the wiper arms. And before we get too carried away with the cowl, let's not forget the sound deadening on the back of the engine. It's going to quiet that loud fuel system down for you. This is going to kind of tuck behind the valve cover, over all the lines back here, and then it will sit on this grommet here. There's one back there, and that's that. Now we can go ahead and drop the cowl in with those 8mm fasteners all around there. So, all right, let's drop this into place. It's going to kind of tuck under the wiper motor. And also keep in mind that these white little speed nuts may have dropped off during the process, so make sure all of those are there before you start resecuring these all together. All right, get that all lined up. I'm just gonna snug these screws up. All right, now we're ready to go ahead and install the upper wiper cowl. I would like to note that if your vehicle has any debris in the windshield little lip at the very end where this will be going into, you may want to take some compressed air and clean that out. Sometimes I like to use a little bit of foaming glass cleaner. Any type of silicone that you would use on there can get some grease onto the windshield, so keep that in mind. You may want to just use some foaming glass cleaner to help guide that into place. But we're going to just drop this in, getting it around the hood struts. If your wiper motor does line up with the little holes in the tray here, you know you're pretty much lined up. So from one side to the other, go ahead and just use your thumb and push it into the groove and work that across before we continue reassembly. Now that we have that cowl installed, let's go ahead and drop in our little corner panels. Ours is missing the little thumb screw, but you're just going to want to tip it into the actual cowl you've just installed. It should drop into this little air duct here and then fall right into place. There we go. And then if you have it, turn that little thumb screw 90 degrees and we'll do the same thing on the other side. And then lock it in place, and we'll go ahead and install our weather stripping on the front of the cowl. So this does have a little lip on the back side that is going to face the wiper cowl, and it's going to kind of clip onto this going along there. And in the front is where we're going to tuck in that wire. So kind of lay it in place, and it does slide into this a little bit. And then start it on the wiper cowl and just kind of follow it along, similar to how we installed the cowl into the windshield. Now that we've got all that fitted, I'm gonna wait for the wiper arm installation. Whenever I take the wiper arms off, I do like to operate them once before reinstalling them. There is a chance when we remove them that they may have adjusted themselves a little bit, so they may not be timed correctly. With a 10 millimeter, we're gonna go ahead and reattach the battery cable. Go ahead and attach that quickly. You'll notice all the lights come on, a bunch of noises, a bunch of relays. Just a snug up there, make sure it's secured. We'll go ahead and drop that back down. There is 2 thumb screws here. Usually you can just push them in by hand and they'll do a 90 degree. Otherwise you can certainly use a flathead screwdriver. Once we've reconnected the battery, it's time to reinstall our wiper arms. To ensure that the wiper arms are installed in the resting position, you'll first want to close the hood and then go back to cycle the wipers. I do want to take a second here to identify both wiper arms. The driver's side is the one that has a little bit of a curvature to it, and the passenger side is the longer, straighter version. So you're probably not going to be able to get these mixed up, but if you do, it's definitely going to wipe the windows in the wrong way. So keep that in mind, either when you take them off the vehicle, put them off to the side of the car, put a piece of tape on them, labeling them left or right, or just keep in mind that the passenger side is straight and the driver's side is curved. So we're going to put them on the glass to start so that we do not move the wiper arm that we just timed. Trying to line it up best to your tape and push that down into place. That's sit like that. Same thing on this one. And then we're going to grab the 16 millimeter nuts and just hand tighten these down before snugging them up with a wrench. We're not going to final torque them until we know that the wipers do operate correctly. Looks like they go back into the same resting position and they do not go any further on the driver's side of the windshield. So that should be good. We can go ahead and torque those down and continue wrapping up the top side of the engine before filling it up with coolant. And we're going to be torquing the 16 millimeter wiper arm nuts to 35 Newton meters. Now we can go ahead and install the little plastic caps on top of the wiper arm. And don't forget that you latched the hood. So now we're going to go ahead, double check the wipers one more time now that we torqued them, and unlatch the hood. Now we're ready to fill the cooling system. We still don't have the engine cover or the DME cover on. It's definitely going to be easier to see down there if you do have a coolant leak with all those covers off. As I said before, certainly much easier with everything removed, but let's go ahead and continue on finishing this up and get this coolant system bled. We've got our U-View coolant filling device, and we've got a bucket of 50/50 concentrate with distilled water. I'm going to start with the valve open, cover the dump valve, if you will, and start to produce some vacuum. We're going to do the high temperature circuit first, and then we'll do the low temperature circuit after that. Close that off once that line fills up. All right, and we're gonna let this sit for a minute just to make sure that we have a good vacuum, make sure that we don't have any leaks before we go ahead and fill it with coolant. All right, it's been about 5 to 10 minutes. The coolant is still holding vacuum, so we know that everything is sealed up tight. We don't have any rolled O-rings, and we don't have anything leaking any coolant. So we're good to go ahead and fill the system now. We have the line primed, there's no air in there. A couple things you want to keep in mind is you want to make sure your bucket is above the reservoir and that the vehicle is flat on the ground. We're probably going to overfill this slightly and then adjust the level once we are out of vacuum. So you can take the line off at this point, and we will just open this valve, keeping an eye on the end of the hose, making sure it stays submerged in coolant. All right, once the coolant kind of balances off, we are just about out of coolant here, and there's no more vacuum in the system. We will slightly adjust the level. As you can see, it is just above the maximum mark, and we want that to be right around the max mark, so anything over that will cause a little bit of a problem. But when we are ready to do the coolant bleed, we want that right at the max mark, and before the coolant bleed is done, it may be a little bit above that. That is not a concern. Once the coolant bleed is done, there may still be a little bit of a air bubble in the system. That little bit of extra coolant will compensate any air that is still trapped in the system. So for the coolant bleed procedure, we'll drop a little bit of coolant down, and once that's all said and done, we'll adjust the coolant level at the end. So I'm gonna get this out of here, And we're gonna get a little bit more coolant for the low temperature circuit. Now, just like we did on the high temperature circuit, we are gonna draw vacuum on the low temperature circuit with the UView coolant bleeder as well. Go ahead and fill it up. All right, yeah, that one's definitely a little overfilled, so we're gonna have to suck some of that out. All right, now that we've adjusted our coolant level in both reservoirs to the maximum mark, we'll put our caps on. We'll catch you guys inside the car for the coolant bleed procedure. Now, before we go ahead and go through the coolant bleed procedure, let's make sure that we don't have any oil leaks and we don't have any oil pressure lights. We did have a lot of the oil and coolant components off, so let's make sure that's good before we go through and rev the vehicle and go through all that. Seems like everything's fine. We have no oil pressure lights. Idling sounds all right. So we'll let this sit for a second. I'm gonna go up front and just double check underneath the car that we have no oil leaks, and we'll be good to go ahead with the coolant bleed procedure. All right, now doing our cooling system bleed, you wanna make sure the car is completely level and you have the hood closed. I've already preset the heater to the hottest setting, and I have the blower function at the lowest single bar on the screen here. We're gonna turn the key on by turning the start-stop button on 3 times really quickly. That will give you ignition power. We're gonna turn our low beams on all the way, put our hazards on. You see I have it at the highest temperature setting and the lowest blower setting. And then I'm gonna hold my foot on the gas pedal for about 20 to 30 seconds. Once you're done with that, we'll start the vehicle up and you should have a service message on the dash. It was about 30 seconds. And we have a service function started. Now the vehicle will go through and do the coolant bleeding procedure as such, so keep an eye on the temperature, make sure you don't have any coolant low message warnings, and allow the vehicle to go through the bleed procedure. And when everything's finished bleeding, you will get the service function finished on the dashboard. So now that we know that's taken care of, let's make sure we do still have enough oil in the car, as we put just shy of the actual level in the vehicle. All right, once you got the car up to operating temperature, you go into the iDrive and get into vehicle status. Then you're gonna go over to the engine oil level. Once you get in here, you have to select engine oil measurement. And if the vehicle is not up to operating temperature, the start measurement right there will not allow you to select it. As you can see, it is highlighted here, so we can actually go up and select that. We are right at max. So as you saw, we didn't add that full 7.2 liters. We're right at where we want to be. And now that we've got our coolant bled and our oil level is good, we can go ahead and wrap up the belly pans underneath the car and get ready for a test drive. Now we're ready to go ahead and install our engine cover. You can certainly leave this off until you're done with your test drive. We're gonna just pop this on so we can show you guys how to do it. Lining up the oil cap is definitely the easiest way to ensure that all of your bushings are gonna simply go onto the intake manifold and press on there firmly. Similar to the engine cover, the DME cover does have 3 stands, and we're just gonna line those up in the bushings in here as well. There we go. Now we're gonna put our front strut braces on. The 16 millimeter and the E14 are gonna be torqued to 56 Newton meters. There we go, got it. All right, everything's almost buttoned up onto the hood. Let's pick the car up in the air and finish putting on our lower belly pan and the front little corner panels and get ready to get this thing out on the road. We're gonna start on the passenger front corner here. You can do either side, but we do wanna get these fitted before the main belly pan. Get that tucked behind the fender liner and up under the bumper here. And then with the pile of 8 millimeter screws you most likely have, we'll start putting these in place. All right, now last but not least, we do have this front belly pan section. It's gonna get tucked underneath the front bumper. And then line up back here. And then the little door for the oil drain. Line up the tabs counterclockwise, and we are ready to go for our test drive. And that pretty much wraps up today's DIY. Don't forget to make sure your coolant level is filled and you have no oil leaks. Obviously, double check your oil level before going out for your road test as well. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If so, hit that like button. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, get down in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe either, because we will have plenty more videos on this vehicle and many others like it. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.